Hello, everybody. I wanted to just go through a few things on this presentation about a risk-benefit analysis, and I'm going to have you complete just a simple one for a quiz. Now, when you're doing this for the quiz, don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. The goal here is to just get you to think about each of the steps in conducting a risk-benefit analysis. So I'll go through the quiz at the end of the presentation. So essentially you're going to be using this form to consider the risks and benefits of an intervention. I'm going to give you a couple of options. One option is to do a risk-benefit analysis of facilitated communication, which is not an evidence-based practice. So you read an article about facilitated communication. Now, some of the parts, like, is the setting adequate and are the staff well trained? Well, unless you have a particular place in mind, you don't really have that data, so you're going to have to just make a hypothetical situation where this procedure would be implemented. The other option you have is to take an intervention that you're actually planning or involved with and conduct a risk-benefit analysis on that procedure. That's actually probably a better option, but I wanted to give folks who were not working in a clinical situation or school situation something else to do. So I'll explain a little more of that later. So what we're going to do in the next few minutes, go through just essentially what is a risk-benefit analysis, how do you do one, how does it work in practice, and what are the benefits to you as a BCBA and to the field in conducting it. The chapter started out with some headlines about an abusive situation or a bad situation, that something that happened. These things do happen. I wasn't involved with it personally, but when I was working for the state of Delaware, there was a situation where a team was working with this young man in a group home, and he was causing a lot of problems. He was a 20-year-old, so he had very adolescent-like behavior. He was in a group home with some older gentlemen. They just simply got tired of him, and there were some incidents where they were aggressive towards him, quite honestly, because he was acting like a jerk. And then he did some things that were physically aggressive. He would leave the group home in the evenings and go hang out at different places where other young people were. So there were a number of problems. As I said, I wasn't involved with the team, but some of the members of the team, and actually the director, got behind this. And they decided that he would be better off in an apartment living by himself. I had worked with him in the past, and I went to the director and told him about my concerns, that I simply thought that this young man didn't have the skills to live on his own, and it was very dangerous to put him in a setting where he was not supervised. And I was pretty much told that I needed to just be quiet and keep my opinion to myself because I wasn't involved with the case, and after all, I was only a master's level psychologist. Yeah, he actually said that to me. So they ended up putting him in an apartment. Fast forward about 6 months, he got very sick. He actually had meningitis, though no one knew it at the time. And he just stayed in bed. He didn't call for help. After he was missing for a few days from work, the social worker went into his apartment and found him dead. And he'd been dead for several days. So I still get upset when I think about that young man, and could I have done more? Could I have made a bigger stink out of things? And I'm not convinced that I shouldn't have. I know I would have brought in a lot of heat from the director, and it was one of the things that ultimately led me to decide that I needed to work somewhere else. But I think about him every time I read this material. So when you're going to consider an intervention, and in this case a move to a different place, you have to look at the benefits and you weigh that against the risks. So what are the risks? And for him, my informal assessment from knowing him was that the risks far outweighed the benefit of not having to deal with some of the problems he was causing at the group home. It wasn't the solution. Now, interestingly, the older BCBA task list actually included a statement about a risk-benefit analysis. And the quotes here, the new version, the one that you're working with, the 4th edition task list, does not include that. And I think that's strange. And risk-benefit analysis is an important part of any kind of treatment, though. And I think it should be included as a step. And I think future revisions of the task list are probably going to put it in. These are just some guidelines. This is from the Bailey book about when you should do a risk-benefit analysis. And he recommends you actually do it before you do any kind of intervention. I think, if you're going to implement a reinforcement program or something, probably the risk-benefit analysis is just a conversation you might have. It could be really simple. I don't think I would go through all the steps outlined here for every single thing I would do. But certainly if I'm going to develop a multi-component behavior support plan, and if the challenging behavior warranted a functional behavior assessment, then I think a risk-benefit analysis should be part of a plan. I'm actually going to include a risk-benefit analysis as part of the functional behavior assessment assignment next semester when I teach the functional behavior assessment course. I haven't done that yet, but just now as I'm recording this, I believe I should. The Bailey book makes reference to a book that was published in 1993, and I've actually been around long enough that I have a copy of this book, and I read it when I was a doctoral student. And it does have a very good chapter where the authors present a decision model. And the reason Bailey makes a big deal about this book and this decision model is it's the only one that Bailey didn't do it because it's the only one I've run into, but apparently it's the only one he could come up with as well. Its risk-benefit analysis is something that's very prevalent in the medical field. In medicine, if a company is going to make a drug available, they will weigh out all the benefits of the medication against all the side effects and all the risks. In other areas or other fields, different disciplines make it a priority to assess benefits versus risks. Historically, we haven't done a great job of that in behavior analysis, but that's changing. So, when we consider the risks of something, we have to look. It's not an exact science. It is subjective, but it does involve using the best information that we can gather. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a systematic or a place where we can get systematic information on the risks associated with every kind of behavioral intervention. The best source of information right now is people who have experience implementing those interventions. So you don't really find it in research articles. Research articles will talk about how they ensured implementation and treatment fidelity. But research articles are typically done by people who have experience and a lot of training in implementing the intervention. They're also usually done in ideal kinds of settings. I had some interesting experiences myself when I was working with Delaware. I worked with a young man who engaged in self-injurious behavior. He would hit himself in the head with his fists. I had done a functional behavior assessment. It was essentially a form of communication for him. He was very prompt dependent. He had a limited vocabulary. He had limited forms of communication. So there were different things he was trying to make happen. It was usually access to something that he wanted access to. So we were working on teaching him, we were doing functional communication training. Uh, there was a change in the system while I was working there. I worked for the state. The group homes were operated by agencies, but all the behavior analysts, I was the senior behavior analyst, and I supervised four behavior analysts that worked in the group homes. So I had my own caseload, and then I supervised the other folks with their caseloads. So this gentleman, the individuals with more severe challenging behavior were on my caseload because I had the most experience at the time as a behavior analyst. The director that I was at odds with, as I mentioned already, he did not like the fact that the behavior analysts were employees of the state. He wanted the agencies to assume those responsibilities. So part of his plan, that wasn't necessarily a bad idea, but he started this model where he had the agencies hire their own behavior analysts, and then we were supposed to be phased out. Well, this particular agency hired a gentleman who had a doctoral degree, and at the time I had a master's degree. But his background was in personnel and industrial psychology, so he had worked with companies with employment issues. He had no real formal training in working with individuals with developmental disabilities. He had taken some courses and he had read a lot of articles. So he had read some articles about self-injurious behavior, and when he saw my intervention plan, and my plan involved a lot of redirecting this individual to use communication, and he had decided that the best option was to put the self-injurious behavior on extinction. And according to the articles he had read, we just needed to eliminate all forms of reinforcement as the first step. That's what he had read somewhere. So he instructed all the staff, if this individual started hitting himself, they were to completely disengage and direct their attention somewhere else. They were to start giving attention to other clients. Theoretically, I think theoretically it's bad on all levels, but the result was extinction bursts occurred. This individual, my former client, ended up putting himself, he was in the emergency room. He hit himself so hard and so many times that he sustained some head injuries. He had trauma. He ended up being hospitalized, and the physicians ordered that he wear mechanical restraints to prevent him from hitting himself. So we went from a guy who was making really good progress but still had a few incidents of self-injury to someone who was on massive doses of tranquilizers, wearing mechanical restraints to keep himself from hitting himself, who had now had some head injury as a result. So another reason that I decided I'd be better off working somewhere else. But in developing that intervention and implementing it, there was really no consideration for, okay, here's the possible benefits. What are the risks? Well, the risk is you can get an extinction burst with a very dangerous behavior. Right there, to me, that is an unacceptable risk. So with a risk-benefit analysis, you spell out what you believe the benefits are, you outline what the risks are, and then you look for, are there any ways to mitigate the risk? Can you do something to make the risk less of a problem? Is there a form of mitigation? Or can you decide that this is an acceptable risk given the benefits we expect to obtain? So in this case, that put this individual at too great of a risk for injury, and either you needed to mitigate that risk or decide on another intervention. Another intervention was actually the way to go here. So if we compare the old book chapter that I was familiar with, it's actually a really good model, and it's one that I used for years. So what's the probability that your intervention is going to be successful? And you base that on existing data. What's the period of time it would take to eliminate the behavior or reduce the behavior? Again, just based on what you know about the person in previous research. What's the level of distress caused by the procedure? So if we take my example of the extinction procedure, what's the probability of success? Well, for adults with long-term challenging behavior, I think the probability of success is very low, because this is a behavior that's been reinforced intermittently for a very long period of time, and to think that extinction is going to eliminate that behavior is just a bad call. Period of time it takes to eliminate the behavior. Well, with extinction, you can get different amounts of time. It depends on the reinforcement history. Again, with a behavior that's been intermittently reinforced for years, you would expect it to take a long time. What's the level of distress caused by the procedure? Well, on the surface, extinction, we're no longer reinforcing a behavior that's been reinforced in the past. So, but you have, in all likelihood, an extinction burst, which would cause a huge amount of distress. And then the distress caused by the behavior. Well, this is self-injury, and it's very high-level self-injury. It's somebody who's very strong, pounding the sides of his head with his fist hard enough to cause damage. So it's quite distressful. What this model does not include is it doesn't really talk about the treatment setting, and it doesn't talk about the individuals implementing the intervention, or it doesn't really directly talk about the effect of other people, like other clients. I guess that could go into the distress caused by the behavior, but this was a model that was really centered around research settings, where you knew everybody was going to be well trained. You knew that the environment was going to be appropriate for implementing the intervention. And it was sort of understood that you would protect other people in the environment. So while this was a good start, it doesn't really address more real-life situations. So the model that Bailey adapted in 2011, and he's used the same one in this last revision of his book, assess the risk factors for each behavioral procedure. So if you have different interventions, what are the risks associated with each one? And this, again, is somewhat subjective. You can look to the literature, but a lot of this is just based on experience of people who have implemented the intervention before. Assess the general risk factors for behavioral treatment. So what are the risk factors with any kind of intervention, not specific to the one that you're implementing? Assess the benefits for behavior treatment. So what are the benefits that you hope to gain from this intervention? This should be a really easy one. If you're having problems coming up with what you think the benefits are going to be of the intervention, then you really need to rethink, why am I doing this intervention? So the importance of including it, though, is sometimes the benefits of an intervention are not always communicated to the parents or care providers or people who are going to be actually implementing the intervention. So everyone involved should have a very good understanding of the goals of the intervention and the purpose. Why are we doing this? And then in the final part, can you reconcile the risks and benefits with key parties involved? So do the people who are going to be living with the intervention, do they buy into it to the extent that they accept the risks that go along with it, and they believe that the proposed benefits outweigh any risk that might be involved? And then, is there any way to mitigate any kind of risk? So that's the basic procedure of doing the risk-benefit analysis. So I like the statement, the goal is not to frighten but enlighten. So everyone involved should have a good idea of what's involved in the intervention. So again, it's something I see extinction's a good example because it is conceptually very simple, and people who are new to the field or beginning level behavior analyst, it has a lot of appeal because, you just start reinforcing the behavior and then it just goes away, So it's on that level, it's real simple. In practice, it has tons of risks with it. I mean, the biggest risk is you run the risk of making the behavior much worse. because what happens is people will try to use extinction for a while. They get an extinction burst and they find themselves in the middle of some kind of episode that is surprising to them, and then they end up responding in such a way that they reinforce a more severe level of the behavior. So that's how a lot of very severe challenging behaviors get shaped. So people implementing it need to understand the risk of reinforcing a higher level of the behavior. Again, procedures like timeout that are used all the time, they have many risks associated with them that not everyone understands. So there's a lot of value to being upfront and honest with everyone about any risk associated with a procedure. It's also important, a lot of interventions have side effects in that they can cause things to happen. So another example that comes to mind here is doing analog functional analysis procedures. One of my students back in Utah decided he wanted to involve teachers and classroom assistants in doing functional analyses, manipulations. This was before he was my student. So he taught them how to do it, and he said, oh, you just do these conditions. See how easy it is? And he wrote out exactly how they were going to do these different conditions. And then, of course, with a functional analysis, you are actually, in some of the conditions, you're doing things that you know is going to make the behavior worse. Well, these were kindergarten kids. They were little kids, so he figured there was minimal risk. I mean, after all, how much harm can a little kid do? But some of these kids, the behaviors were physical aggression. And when these teachers started actually reinforcing challenging behavior in some of these conditions, they started getting pinched and hit. And that wasn't something he had prepared them for. So they stopped implementing the functional analysis, and they actually complained to their supervisor about it, and he got in a lot of trouble. I think the biggest problem is he expected people to be able to carry out a functional analysis with minimal training, and he didn't prepare either the teachers who were implementing it or the administration for some of the unintended side effects. Or in this case, they're actually intended. You expect the behaviors to get worse, but he didn't really prepare people on how to deal with it when those things happened. The chapter talks a little bit about what risk actually is. And of course, in medication and when insurance companies assess risk, sometimes they talk about death or severe injury. Most of the time, we're not talking about death, although the example I gave you, that was the outcome of a very bad decision by a team. But what are some of the possible outcomes? And what can we do to protect against those outcomes? So sometimes people haven't actually considered risk associated with interventions until they sit down and start using them or planning them. So to use the medical model analogy again with drugs, we're weighing out what's the probability of death or toxicity from a medication or harmful side effects versus the effectiveness of the drug. Earlier in my life, I no longer have to take it, but for about 25 years, I took Dilantin because I developed grand mal seizures when I was a senior in high school. It was actually the end of my junior year, and for a period of several years, I would have these seizures, and I would just, they were full-blown tonic-clonic seizures that would last about 30 minutes sometimes. And I took Dilantin. Some of the side effects, it affects your liver functioning. It has some other side effects that are not great long term. Fortunately, I no longer have to take it. About 7 years ago, I decided to try to come off of it. So under the guidance of my physician. But risk when I was taking it was the risk of having a seizure while I was driving or something was much greater than the possible the, the risk of the side effects, which were there and they were real, but weighing out the benefit versus the risk, I took the medication. But then when it was no longer needed, then I don't take it anymore. The side effects would not be worth the risk to me right now. Because the probability of me having a seizure, I think, is extremely low since I haven't had one for 25 years. So with implementing a behavioral procedure, we do the same thing. What's the risk of failure or risk of the intervention not working versus the benefit or the harm that we might from it? Thought this was a cute little cartoon. The path of least resistance is not always the best path to take. You might get there faster, but you might not be in great shape when you get there. So in the chapter, he provides a model for the steps of how to go through and conduct a risk-benefit analysis. It's really a simple sheet, but it actually requires you to do some homework. You need to do some research about the different interventions that you're planning to use so that you can fill out the sheet in a meaningful way. So on the sheet we consider 8 different general risk factors. First one is the nature of the behavior. So the more severe or intense the problem behavior, the greater the risk of the intervention not working. The next one is the personnel involved. Do the people who are going to be implementing the intervention, are they able to do it in the way in which it was intended, or is there a risk of people misusing the intervention? Related to that, how well trained are the people who are going to be implementing the intervention? Are they people who have experience with similar interventions, or are they folks who have very little or limited experience? Is the setting appropriate for the intervention you're planning? So in the case of my student that tried to, with very little training, have kindergarten teachers and their assistants do functional analysis manipulations in a general education kindergarten setting, that was not an appropriate setting for that type of assessment or there are other kinds of interventions where you really have to weigh out, is this something that can safely be done in this setting? I think I may have mentioned I did some work when I was in Utah with parents who were developmentally disabled. They had a child who was also developmentally disabled, but he was actually functioning on a higher level than they were. And that created a very difficult situation. I had to be very careful when I was designing interventions that I was teaching them to implement, because I had to consider what can these folks actually do. So it was a very basic reinforcement system, and then I had to teach them to respond differently when challenging behavior occurred. I had to teach them an alternative behavior. So it was really, it was more of a two-tiered behavior plan that I developed, because it was a behavior plan for the parents to change their behavior that would in turn change the behavior of their child. Is the BCBA, the person who's designing the intervention, does that person have the proper training and experience for the intervention that's being developed? So I certainly have areas in which I feel I am better prepared to operate in, and I work with other colleagues who have experience in different areas, so we refer things to each other. And what are the risks to others in the intervention setting? So the risk to the staff, if we're in a school setting, the risk to other students. What's the risk of the behavior continuing the way it is versus the risk of implementing the intervention? And then finally, buy-in. To what, I think we actually have one more after this. To what extent do people who are going to be implementing the intervention buy in with the program? This comes with understanding it as well. Are they educated about it? Do they understand the possible risks? And do they buy into it philosophically? And then the personal liability issue. To what extent can the person in charge handle or mitigate any kinds? Next, we consider 5 potential benefits of an intervention, and we're given a template to consider benefits. One of them is client direct. So this is the most straightforward one. To what extent will the client, the person whose behavior is being changed, to what extent will that person actually benefit from the intervention? So what are the expected changes in level of the behavior, and what's the time frame for those changes? The next benefit is more indirect to the setting. So if you have a setting where there's a person with severe challenging behavior, that individual impacts that setting to a great degree. So if we improve that problem, to what extent will that impact the setting, the climate, the atmosphere there? To what extent is it going to become a better place for students and for or clients and staff? Bailey talks about the benefit to mediators or caregivers, and the sense that if you're involved with a successful intervention, it builds morale. It makes people feel better about their roles and their accomplishments. So they have a sense of pride. I think this is related to people just receiving reinforcement for what they do. So the behavior of actually implementing interventions with fidelity gets reinforced, which can carry over into other kinds of interventions. And what's the benefit to others in the setting? So other clients or students in the setting, to what extent do they benefit? So in a school setting, if the educational staff are spending a lot of their time and energy addressing an individual's challenging behavior, that is going to take away from time that other students get instruction. If it's some kind of residential facility and there's someone engaging in aggressive behavior or very severe kinds of property destruction, that detracts from those individuals being able to just carry on their lives. So to what extent will other people benefit in the setting? And then to what extent will the liability of the setting be decreased? So some challenging behaviors, when I worked in the New Jersey Center for Autism, we had one young lady who would just, she had really severe elopement behavior. She would just take off and try to go to a convenience store and start getting all kinds of ice cream treats and stuff. And there was a busy road between the program and the convenience store. She made it there a couple of times. She was just very quick and very sneaky. There was a huge liability issue with her. We had another situation where this gentleman would bite other people really severely. He got me a couple of times. He bit another student, and the parent of the student who was bitten sued the facility because she believed they didn't take adequate measures to protect her son. So, to what extent will decreasing these behaviors decrease the liability of the setting? That's a very real issue. So, I'm giving you a situation here. Joanna, BCBA, is asked to consult with a third grade classroom. Miss Hobbs has complained that one of her students, Jared, continuously gets out of his seat, talking to classmates while doing work, and consistently raising his hand to make disruptive comments. Well, at least he's raising his hand, huh? This results in Jared's poor performance in school, classmates being distracted from their work, and the teacher's attention at the same time trying to get Jared back on task. Miss Hobbs has been teaching for several years, but has never implemented a behavior procedure before and is eager for any help in the classroom. After conducting a functional assessment and several observations, it's found that Jared likely engages in this behavior in order to escape from or delay work. Joanna suggests implementing non-contingent reinforcement of escape procedure in which Jared can have access to 2 minutes of leisure activity at his desk, playing with his iPod, every 5 minutes during independent work. A little bit of an odd intervention, but let's go with it. So, here's a couple of examples. So on the left, you've got the non-contingent reinforcement of escape procedure, and on the other, you've got, just for another example, a timeout procedure. So what are the risks with the non-contingent reinforcement procedure? Well, it may reduce his motivation to engage in adaptive behavior. Well, remember, non-contingent reinforcement is an antecedent procedure that changes the motivating operation. So if somebody's trying to escape and you're giving them escape non-contingently, they're less motivated to escape. Well, if you're teaching him a behavior, let's say you're going to teach him to ask for a break, he's going to have less of a need to ask for a break now. So you could actually reduce the effectiveness of trying to teach that alternative behavior by using that particular antecedent strategy. And that's a real risk that you have to consider with a number of antecedent strategies. There's also a chance of pairing the problem behavior with the escape. So since it happens randomly, I guess he could engage in a behavior and then happen to get access to non-contingent escape, and then you could surreptitiously reinforce it. You can actually overcome that by not letting him escape if he happens to be engaging in some challenging behavior. And then the final one is non-contingent reinforcement of escape can disrupt the instructional process. So if he's in the middle of working on something and things are going well, and then he randomly takes a break, then you got to get him back on task. So those are all real risks with a procedure that on the surface appears really benign. The benefits is it's easy to do. It's creates a positive learning environment. It may actually help him view the situations more positively. If it's implemented along with extinction, you could reduce an extinction burst because you're giving escape non-contingently. And there's the chance that escape could be paired with appropriate behavior and it could strengthen it. I'm already seeing some stuff here that would make me decide that this is probably not the way I would want to go. I could do a few things differently and I could come up with a better intervention. So this is the kind of discussion you would have with a group. And if I were the BCBA on the team, I'd say, look, let's try something differently. I'm concerned that this antecedent strategy, since I really want to teach him to manage himself, I'm concerned that using this non-contingent escape might be an abolishing operation to appropriate request for escape. And that, for me, is enough reason to do something differently. I also don't like the fact that he might be engaged in a challenging behavior and then randomly get to escape. So that's a risk I'm not willing to take. I'd rather do something differently. So I'd rather actually just teach him to request a break and do it the right way so that immediately I'm giving him a break and then I start increasing delays. So I try to steer the team in that direction. But this can be a good way to communicate some of your concerns about an intervention. And then if we look at timeout, we can see some other risks. Now, timeout is one that people more readily associate with risks, but don't always consider. So they've outlined some good risks for timeout. The right column on each form is a place for you to write notes. This could be done during a meeting when you're discussing it. So you may decide in the notes you could make comments about how, yeah, this is really a difficult risk and this could be a real problem. For instance, with the may reduce the student's motivation to engage in adaptive behavior, that's where you would spell out the issue of the possible abolishing operation that makes escape less important as a reinforcer, and it could interfere with teaching an appropriate alternative behavior. If you have ideas for mitigating the risk, this is also the place to write them in the notes section. So this is more of a worksheet where you work out how bad is this risk and how is it just unacceptable, or what are things we can do to mitigate it. And then the same with the benefits. How important is this benefit? And or is this a benefit that maybe we don't feel is balanced against a particular risk? So this is a place to spell all of that stuff out. In this section, we're just talking about general risk factors. So the 8 general risk factors have to do, if we list them out, the nature of the behavior, is there sufficient personnel, are they skilled, is the setting appropriate, is the person designing the intervention experienced, and does this person have the skills to adequately address this case? Are there any risk to other people in the setting? Is there adequate buy-in? Is there any liability to the person involved in implementing it? So these are all the things we talked about before, so we can address each of these. And then over on the right, you see how with the timeout intervention, how each of these were addressed. Then we do the same thing with the benefits. We go through each of the benefits and we chart out what's specific about this benefit that's important, or to what extent is it maybe not as important as we thought. And then at the bottom you can just summarize overall, how do the risks and benefits weigh out, or how could the risks be mitigated and how could the benefits be enhanced. So on this page, we're just looking at how this would all work in practice. So you could fill out these forms as part of a meeting where you're reviewing the intervention. After you've done a functional behavior assessment and you've looked at research associated with the treatment, then you're more educated about potential risks and benefits, so you can have conversations with anyone involved with implementing the intervention. Be sure that everybody is, once they're educated about it, they're trained, they're aware of the risk, they're aware of the benefits. And this may be the time when you actually consider other options if it's clear that the intervention is not going to be a good fit for that setting. And finally, some additional benefits. When you have an intervention that really works, it is an awesome feeling. I think if you stay in this profession for a long time, it has to be extremely satisfying and important to you when you see a significant improvement in the life of someone for whom you developed an intervention. If I think back at my peak moments, it's always been when you taught some critical skill to a person with a disability and you saw the way that impacted that person's life and how that gave that person options, or you helped someone who had some severe challenging behavior and you see that removed barriers for that person. If you're not motivated by that, then you'll find something else to do. I think just like anything else, that has to be important to you. And over the years, I've seen people that wasn't a big motivator for them. They were more. I've known some people in the profession that sort of liked the idea of saying they were a behavior analyst or something, and it really wasn't that important that they impact the lives of other people. And they typically are doing something else in about 5 years. But if that's important to you, then you look for those moments. And people I've known who have stayed engaged with the field find a way to connect to those moments in their life. I know that for me that's been really important, and I always I look for, well, one thing about myself, that's another reason I stay involved with research, is that I like to work directly with individuals with special needs. And by being involved with research, that helps me do that. I don't think I would be happy just teaching classes, although I really enjoy that a great deal, but I need to stay connected to the applied end of the field. So it definitely improves your morale, and it makes you more engaged with the field when you experience success. It also is, certainly there's the issue of liability, and I do carry professional liability insurance, and I strongly encourage all of you to do that as well. If you're a member of the Association for Behavior Analysts International, it's very inexpensive. I get insurance through that organization for something like, I think, $150 a year that covers me up to $2 million in damages. When you have success, your liability is reduced. And then you also is the possible contribution to a body of knowledge that is going to help other people. So you're benefiting the field as well, especially if you're doing those interventions in the context of some kind of research study. So consider using a risk-benefit analysis or incorporating it into your work as a behavior analyst. I'll write up the short quiz with an explanation. Again, don't overthink this quiz. The main experience is to just give you some experience considering each of these risk questions. All right? So look for the quiz and have a good week.